The quiet Phoenix street fell completely still as three matte black SUVs rolled to a slow stop in front of the old Harmon Hill estate. Curtains parted in windows. A neighbor lowered her garden hose. Someone's sprinkler kept running, but nobody was watching it anymore. A young man stepped out of the center vehicle, broad-shouldered, unhurried, dressed in a charcoal Italian suit that fit him like a second skin. For a moment, no one on the street could place him. But across the lawn, near the iron gate she once considered her territory, a woman in a red velvet dress went completely still. Her hand tightened around the strap of her handbag. Her breath left her body like something had knocked it loose. 7 years ago, on this exact street, she had looked this same man in the eye and told him he would never be enough. While he stood there holding a pair of garden shears, dirt on his boots, sawdust on his shirt, a straw hat casting a shadow over a face she had decided wasn't worth believing in. She had left him for a man with a Porsche and a penthouse. She had chosen status over substance. She had chosen spectacularly wrong. Because the man standing on that driveway now, the one whose company just acquired this entire block, the one with his name on 5 skylines across the American South, is Ray Caldwell. The same Ray who once trimmed her hedges for $50 in change. He finds her face in the crowd. He holds her gaze for exactly 1 second. Then he turns and walks through the gate like she was never worth a second look. Before this story goes any further, drop in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if you love stories about people who turned their pain into power, hit subscribe, because this one is going to stay with you. 7 years earlier, long before anyone in Phoenix had ever heard the name Ray Caldwell spoken with anything other than mild indifference, the man existed in the quiet, invisible world of people who build beautiful things for people who never bother to learn their names. Phoenix in the summer is not a forgiving city. The sun doesn't rise there so much as it arrives, heavy, immediate, already at full power by 7 in the morning. The suburbs stretched in every direction, gated communities with identical terracotta rooftops, manicured lawns that didn't happen by accident, rose bushes trimmed with a level of precision that required both talent and patience. Most people drove past those lawns and never wondered who kept them looking that way. Ray Caldwell was one of the people they never wondered about. He was known, in the quiet way that working men are known. Not famous, not celebrated, just recognized. The landscaper on Harmon Hill Road. The guy with the white pickup and the straw hat. If you needed your hedges done right, if you wanted edging so clean it looked like it was drawn with a ruler, you called Ray. He was 26 years old, lean and strong from years of physical work, with calloused hands that moved with a kind of quiet precision that his clients noticed but never commented on out loud. His workspace was the back of that pickup truck and whatever yard he happened to be standing in that morning. No office, no receptionist, a toolbox, a set of shears worn smooth at the handles, and a battered spiral notebook he carried everywhere, filled not with client orders but with sketches, landscape designs, property layouts, ideas that had no business living inside a $200 a-month toolbox but refused to leave. People occasionally glanced at his notebook and said something polite. Nobody took it seriously. Beautiful ideas, after all, don't pay invoices. Every evening, when the desert heat finally eased its grip and the sky over Phoenix turned that particular shade of burnt copper, Ray drove his pickup back to a small apartment on the east side of the city. There was no crowd waiting for him. No children running across a dirt yard. Just the hum of the AC unit, the smell of cut grass still clinging to his clothes, and that notebook open on the kitchen table under a single overhead light. The only witness to what he was actually capable of becoming. But Ray was not alone in the way that truly lonely men are alone. He had Gary. Gary Voss had been called beautiful her entire life, and she had learned, the way beautiful people sometimes do, to treat that fact like a business asset. She was sharp-featured, sharp-tongued, and possessed of an ambition she hadn't yet figured out how to aim correctly. When she met Ray at a mutual friend's backyard party 3 years earlier, she had found him refreshing. Honest in a way that polished men rarely were, funny in a way that didn't need an audience, and genuinely, almost stubbornly devoted to her. In the beginning, she had told herself that kind of love was rare. She had told herself it was enough. In the beginning, she had almost been right. Ray Caldwell was always first on the street. Before the neighborhood dogs started barking, before the sprinkler systems clicked on their automated morning routines, before the first garage door groaned open anywhere on Harmon Hill Road, Ray's white pickup was already parked at the curb with the tailgate down and the tools laid out in the order he would need them. He worked with the kind of quiet efficiency that only comes from loving what you do, or from needing the money badly enough that you train yourself to love it anyway. With Ray, it had always been both. He moved through the early morning yards the way a musician moves through a familiar song, not thinking about the notes anymore, just feeling where the next one should fall. The shears were an extension of his hands. The straw hat, tilted just enough to keep the rising sun out of his eyes, had been with him so long the sweat stains had become part of the design. He smelled like cut grass and SPF 50 by 7 in the morning, and he wouldn't smell like anything else until well after dark. The work was honest. It was skilled. It paid him just enough to keep believing the gap between where he was and where he wanted to be was closable. If he was patient, if he was disciplined, if he kept filling that notebook. The notebook went everywhere. It was a plain black spiral, the cheap kind from a drugstore, and it had been replaced 4 times in 3 years because he filled every page. Not with client notes or billing records, with drawings. Landscape designs that extended far beyond trimmed hedges and seasonal color schemes, full property layouts, elevation sketches, irrigation architectures, concepts for outdoor living spaces that turned backyards into destinations, ideas that belonged in a boardroom presentation, scribbled in ballpoint pen in a pickup truck during lunch breaks. Gary had seen the notebook. She had flipped through it once, early in their relationship when she still found his intensity charming rather than inconvenient. She'd said the drawings were impressive. She had not said it again. By the time they were engaged, the notebook lived on Ray's side of the table, and Gary moved around it the way you move around furniture that has always been slightly in the wrong place. Without complaint, but without pretending it wasn't there. Their apartment was small and kept clean by Ray's discipline more than Gary's interest. His tools lived in the truck. His work clothes were washed separately. He made sure of that. He understood, without Gary ever having to say it directly, that the smell of his work was not something she wanted following her through the living room. He understood a lot of things without being told. He understood why she preferred they meet her friends downtown rather than have them pick her up. He understood why she changed the subject when someone asked what he did for work, pivoting smoothly to her own part-time waitressing job at the country club as though his answer might complicate the air in the room. He understood the particular way her smile went careful and controlled when her girlfriend spotted his truck from across a parking lot, that half-second recalibration she performed before turning back to the conversation, seamless and practiced and heartbreaking. He understood all of it. He just loved her too much to let himself fully believe what it meant. Because when it was just the two of them, no friends, no audience, no one to perform financial stability for, Gary could be soft in a way that undid him completely. She laughed at his jokes. She read his notebook in silence sometimes and traced her finger over his drawings without saying a word. She fell asleep with her head on his shoulder like she had decided, privately, that this was where she belonged. Ray held on to that version of her like a man who knows the tide is coming but hasn't moved yet. His love for her was enormous. His bank account was not. And in Phoenix, Arizona, in a world where zip codes were a personality trait and a man's truck told people everything they needed to know before he opened his mouth, that gap was about to become impossible to ignore. The invitation had been on the refrigerator for 3 weeks, cream cardstock with gold foil lettering, the kind that announces itself before you've even read the name. Courtney Bellmere was engaged to a man named Travis who worked in private equity, and the party was being held at his family's property in Arcadia, the kind of Phoenix neighborhood where the houses didn't have addresses so much as they had reputations. Gary had spent 2 weeks deciding what to wear. She landed on white, a fitted, sleeveless dress that stopped just above the knee, clean and deliberate, the kind of outfit that understood exactly the room it was walking into. She looked stunning. Ray told her so 3 times before they reached the car, and each time she smiled in that way that meant she already knew, but appreciated that he noticed. She was luminous in the passenger seat, one hand resting on the windowsill, watching the city change around them as they drove west toward money. Ray wore the best thing he owned: dark trousers, a button-down in a deep navy blue, shoes he'd polished the night before with the same attention he gave his tools. He looked fine. He looked like a man who had tried. In most rooms, that would have been enough. This was not most rooms. The Bellmere party was held on a lawn that made Ray's best client's yard look like a median strip. String lights were strung between mature olive trees. A bartender in a white jacket stood behind a table that held more bottles than Ray's apartment had cabinet space. The guests moved through it all with the specific ease of people who had grown up assuming that life looked like this: fluid, unhurried, casually expensive. Gary found her friends within minutes, absorbed back into a circle of women who kissed cheeks and shrieked warmly and assessed each other's outfits in the half-second before the hug. Ray stood at her side and smiled and shook hands when introduced, and he was good at it. Genuinely warm, easy with people, the kind of man who could hold a conversation anywhere. For a while, it almost worked. Then one of the girlfriends, a woman named Sloane with a tennis bracelet and a voice trained to carry, let her eyes move to Ray with a smile that was shaped like a compliment but built like a question. "And what do you do, Ray?" he told her. "Landscaping. His own business. Working on expanding into design." Sloane held the smile perfectly. "How fun," she said, and turned back to Gary. He felt the temperature change before he could name it. Watched Courtney lean in close to Gary while he was getting them drinks. Their heads tilted together in the way that means something is being said that isn't meant to travel. Watched Gary laugh at whatever it was. Not her real laugh, but the social one, the managed one, the laugh she used when she needed to seem unbothered. On the drive home, she said nothing. Not angry, nothing. Not tired, nothing. Just nothing. The particular silence of a person who has made a decision and is still arranging it quietly in the back of their mind before they're ready to say it out loud. She watched the freeway lights streak past the window and kept her hands folded in her lap, and Ray drove and let the silence be what it was because he loved her and he was patient, and he still believed at that point that patience was the same thing as security. He reached over at a red light and put his hand over hers. She let him. But something behind her eyes had already shifted, and no amount of patience was going to shift it back. The question Sloane had asked, "How fun?" hadn't been a question at all. It had been a verdict. And somewhere between that lawn and this freeway, Gary had quietly agreed with it. Derek Holt did not walk into rooms so much as he arrived in them, the way a weather system arrives, changing the pressure before anyone can explain why they're suddenly paying attention. He came into the Saguaro Club on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, the kind of day when the Phoenix heat had finally started to loosen its grip, and the lunch crowd ran later than usual. He was with two other men in the easy, performative way that wealthy men are sometimes with other wealthy men. Not quite friends, more like people who found each other's company professionally useful and had dressed accordingly. All three of them wore the kind of clothes that don't need to announce themselves. The clothes just fit, and that was the announcement. Gary was working the terrace section that afternoon. She had taken the part-time waitressing job at the Saguaro Club 8 months earlier, telling herself and Ray both that it was temporary, a way to cover the gap while she figured out her next move. She was good at it, efficient, charming, able to read a table the moment she approached it. The club's members tipped well when they remembered to, and mostly she preferred it when they didn't notice her at all. Being invisible in a room like that had its own particular humiliation that she had learned to metabolize quietly, shift by shift. Derek Holt noticed her immediately. She felt it before she saw it, the way his attention settled on her when she approached the table, distinct from the vague indifference she had grown used to performing around. He ordered without looking at the menu, something she'd learned to associate with a specific kind of confidence, the kind that comes from never having had to check a price. His watch caught the afternoon light when he reached for his water glass, a detail that registered in her peripheral vision before she could stop it from registering. She learned later it was a Patek Philippe. She didn't know that yet. She just knew it cost more than anything she had ever touched. His shoes were white, immaculate, structurally perfect, The kind of white that required either tremendous wealth or tremendous care to maintain in a desert city where everything eventually took on the color of the dust. There was not a scuff on them, not a single compromise with the ground he walked on. She thought involuntarily of Ray's work boots by the apartment door. The dried red clay pressed into the treads, the laces replaced twice because the originals had worn through, the particular way they smelled at the end of a long day, like the earth had claimed them permanently and Ray had accepted the terms. Derek's shoes had never made that kind of arrangement with anything. He waited until his colleagues were absorbed in a separate conversation, and then he looked up at her with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who was accustomed to getting what he decided he wanted. "You look like you're supposed to be on the other side of this," he said. Not a line, exactly. More like an observation delivered with the confidence of someone who believed his observations carried weight. Gary kept her expression neutral, professional. "Can I get you anything else?" "I'm sure you can," he said, and smiled in a way that suggested he had all the time in the world and intended to use it. She didn't correct his assumption. She didn't redirect the conversation. She took the empty bread plate from the edge of the table and walked back toward the kitchen at the same measured pace she always used, and she did not look back. But she thought about what he'd said for the rest of her shift. And when she got home that evening, Ray was at the kitchen table with his notebook open and sawdust still on his collar. And for the first time, the sight of him felt like a question she wasn't sure she wanted to keep answering. It had taken Ray an entire weekend to finish the front yard. He'd planned it for weeks, sketched it in the notebook, priced out the materials quietly so it would be a surprise, then spent Saturday and Sunday on his knees in the September heat, laying the flagstone path, planting the bougainvillea along the fence line, edging the grass with the precision he gave his best clients. He'd finished just before sundown on Sunday and stood back and looked at it the way he looked at everything he built. Not with pride exactly, but with the particular satisfaction of a man who had taken something ordinary and made it worth stopping for. Gary had come outside and said it was beautiful. She had kissed him on the cheek. She had gone back inside. 3 weeks later, she was standing in the middle of that same yard, and she was not there to admire it. Ray had come home to find her outside already, which was unusual enough that he registered it before he'd even killed the engine. She was standing near the flagstone path in a cream blouse and dark trousers, her hair down, composed in the careful way of someone who had been rehearsing. He noticed the necklace before he noticed her expression, a delicate gold chain with a small pendant that he had not bought her, that he had never seen before, that caught the late afternoon light in the way that new things do. He got out of the truck. He still had his garden shears in his hand from the last job of the day. He didn't put them down. She didn't make him wait. That was the thing he would remember afterward, that she was efficient about it, like she'd decided that kindness, in this particular instance, looked like speed. She told him he was a good person. She said it the way people say it when they need it to serve as both a compliment and a conclusion, a door being closed gently but completely. She told him she had been doing a lot of thinking. She told him she needed more than good. She reached into her pocket and held out the ring. And when he didn't immediately take it, she set it carefully on top of the fence post beside her, like she was leaving a tip. Then she told him that landscaping was not a future. She said it plainly, without cruelty in her voice, which somehow made it land harder than cruelty would have, as though she wasn't trying to wound him, just correct a misunderstanding he'd been carrying around for too long. Ray stood on the flagstone path he had laid with his own hands and said nothing. Not because he had nothing to say, but because the distance between what he was feeling and what language could actually carry was too great to cross in that moment. He held the garden shears at his side and looked at her and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she had not decided this today. She had decided this at Courtney Belmere's party and maybe before that, and everything since had just been the quiet, methodical process of a woman arranging her exit. A black Porsche turned onto the street. It stopped at the curb and didn't pull into the driveway because the man driving it had never pretended this was his home. Gary picked up her bag from the porch step. It was already packed, which meant she had done this before he arrived, which meant she had stood in this yard alone and made her peace with the decision before he ever had the chance to respond to it. She walked down the flagstone path without looking back, got into the car, The door closed with the quiet, expensive sound of a well-engineered thing. Ray stood there until the Porsche had turned the corner and disappeared. Then he sat down on the porch steps, the garden shears still in his hand, the ring sitting on the fence post catching the last of the evening light, and he didn't move until the yard went dark and the bougainvillea he'd planted dissolved into shadow around him. He had built this yard to show her something. She had used it as a stage to show him something else entirely. He sat with that until dark. Then he went inside alone. The first thing to go was his focus. Not dramatically. Ray didn't collapse in any way that would have been visible from the outside. He got up in the mornings. He loaded the truck. He drove to his jobs and did the work and drove home again. But the notebook stayed closed, and the bids he should have been chasing sat unreturned on his phone. And somewhere between the driveway and the front door each evening, he lost whatever thread of forward momentum had been holding the whole operation together. He started keeping bourbon on the kitchen counter instead of the cabinet. It was a small distinction that meant nothing and meant everything. The missed bids became missed calls. The missed calls became a gap in the schedule he told himself he'd fill next week, and then the week after that. He dropped a commercial account because he forgot to confirm the renewal. He let a residential client go because the follow-up required an energy he was spending elsewhere, mostly on sitting at the kitchen table at midnight with the notebook closed in front of him and a glass that needed refilling. He was not dramatic about any of it. That was almost the problem. If he'd been loud in his grief, someone might have intervened. Instead, he was quiet and functional, and slowly, methodically falling behind on everything that mattered. The eviction notice arrived on a Thursday. White envelope tucked into the doorframe, the kind of official language that doesn't soften itself for anyone. 30 days. He stood in the doorway and read it twice and then set it on the counter next to the bourbon and sat down and looked at the wall for a long time. He thought about Gary. Then he stopped thinking about Gary. Not as an act of strength, more as an act of simple arithmetic. She was not coming back. The ring had been on the fence post. The Porsche had turned the corner. The math was finished, and he was the only one still trying to solve it. He called his friend Danny Reyes that same night. Danny had a 2-car garage in Tempe he used for 1 car and general storage. He said yes before Ray finished asking. Ray packed in 2 hours. The furniture stayed. It came with the apartment and he'd never owned it anyway. He took his clothes, his tools, his phone charger, and the notebook. That was the inventory of Ray Caldwell at 37 years old, reduced to what fit in a pickup truck and what didn't. The garage smelled like motor oil and cardboard. He slept on a folding cot and used Danny's kitchen in the mornings and told himself this was temporary with the specific ferocity of a man who needs the word to mean something more than it statistically does. Then, somewhere in the second week, something shifted. He opened the notebook. Not to look at it. To add to it. 3 new sketches before midnight, better than anything he'd drawn before, drawn with the concentrated energy of a man who had run out of distractions and found, underneath them, that the original idea was still intact and had been waiting with considerable patience. He called a former client and asked if she knew anyone with commercial property needing grounds work. She gave him 2 names. He called both of them the same afternoon, standing in the garage doorway with the notebook open on a shelf beside him, speaking with a certainty in his voice that the folding cot behind him did not technically support. One of them said yes. He put the money toward a part-time hire, a 20-year-old named Caleb who worked hard and didn't ask unnecessary questions. He ordered new business cards, different ones, not Ray Caldwell Landscaping, just Caldwell Design Grounds. It was a small change. It was not a small change. He stopped waiting to be enough for someone else. He started building something that didn't require anyone's permission to exist. The bourbon stayed on the counter for another week. Then he put it in the cabinet. Then he threw it away. The notebook stayed open. Ray found out about Marcus Webb the way most things worth knowing find their way to people who are finally paying attention, through a side door, almost accidentally, from someone who didn't realize what they were handing over. Caleb mentioned it on a Tuesday. A massive new build going up on the northeast edge of Scottsdale, backing up against the McDowell Sonoran Preserve. $4 million of custom construction for some tech executive relocating from the Bay Area. The general contractor was a man named Briggs who had given Caleb's uncle a roofing job 2 years prior. The landscape architect the owner had initially hired had withdrawn from the project over a contract dispute. The slot was open. Briggs hadn't filled it yet. Ray asked how long ago Caleb had heard this. 4 days ago, Caleb said. Ray called Briggs that afternoon. Briggs was polite and non-committal in the way of a man who has options and is not particularly worried about filling them. He told Ray the owner had already received 2 formal proposals from established firms. He mentioned, without quite saying it directly, that a one-truck operation working out of a residential garage in Tempe was not the obvious candidate for a property of this scale. Ray thanked him, asked for the site address, and said he'd like to see the land before he put anything together. Briggs paused. Then he said he supposed that was fine. Ray drove out to the property on a Wednesday morning and stood on the raw, unfinished earth for 2 hours with his notebook. The site was extraordinary. Elevated terrain with natural rock formations along the eastern edge, a slope that most designers would have fought against, and Ray immediately understood as the entire point. The preserve stretched out beyond the property line like a permanent, uncrowded backyard. The views at the northern corner, if the main outdoor space were positioned correctly, would face 4 distinct mountain ranges simultaneously. He filled 11 pages. He went back to the garage and kept going. He worked through 2 nights with the kind of focus that doesn't require discipline because it doesn't feel like work. The kind that arrives when a person is finally operating at the exact level their ability has always been waiting for. He drew the full site layout. The terraced garden levels following the natural contour of the slope, the pool positioned to reflect the preserve rather than compete with it. The outdoor kitchen and fire pit sequence oriented precisely for the evening wind pattern he'd noted during his site visit. Materials, drainage architecture, seasonal planting rotations. It was not a bid. It was a vision. He drove to Scottsdale on Friday without an appointment. Briggs had given him Marcus Webb's project address but not his contact. Ray called Briggs from the driveway and told him he was outside with something the owner needed to see in person. There was a long pause. Then Briggs made a call. 15 minutes later, Marcus Webb walked out of the construction trailer in jeans and a quarter-zip, coffee in hand, looking at Ray with the evaluating expression of a man who had built companies by deciding quickly whether someone had something real or was wasting his time. Ray opened the notebook on the hood of the truck. Marcus didn't say anything for a while. He turned pages slowly. He went back twice to the northern terrace layout. He looked out at the site and then back at the drawings in the specific way of someone matching a thing to its potential, checking the gap between what is and what could be. "Who else have you done at this scale?" Marcus asked. Ray told him the truth. No one. But he could walk him through the engineering logic of every decision on those pages, and by the time he finished, Marcus would understand why that didn't matter. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then he closed the notebook and handed it back. "Come inside," he said. "I don't just need a landscaper. I've been looking for someone to help me think about the whole property as a system. I want to talk about what that would look like." Ray followed him into the trailer. He walked in as a landscaper with a notebook and a folding cot in a Tempe garage. He walked out an hour and 40 minutes later as something he didn't have a clean word for yet. But the word developer was close, and getting closer by the minute. The garage became an office that weekend. Caleb got a full-time contract. The notebook got transferred, page by page, into a proper design document that Ray formatted on a second-hand laptop until 2 in the morning. He had stopped being a man waiting for permission. He had become a man building something that didn't require it. The Marcus Webb estate took 8 months to complete, and by the time the last terrace stone was laid and the first desert sage bloomed along the northern slope, 3 of Marcus's colleagues had already called Ray directly. That was how it began. Not with a press release or a pitch deck or a carefully staged moment of arrival. Just the oldest form of business acceleration there is. A finished thing that spoke for itself, sitting on a hillside in Scottsdale where the right people could see it. Ray didn't celebrate the Webb project's completion. He took one photograph of the finished northern terrace at sunrise. the mountain ranges stacked behind it exactly as he'd drawn them in the notebook 11 pages in, and then he drove back to the office, a real office now, leased space in a Tempe business park, small but legitimate, and opened the next file. The years that followed moved the way productive years do, fast in memory, dense in detail, each one heavier with consequence than the last. The second project was a private estate in North Scottsdale. The third and fourth came simultaneously, a corporate campus redesign and a residential community development, both in the greater Phoenix area, both larger than anything Ray had priced 2 years earlier. He hired a designer, then a project manager, then 2 more crews. He moved out of the Tempe office into something bigger and stopped noticing the square footage because he was always either on site or on the phone or at the desk at 6 in the morning with the notebook open and a coffee going cold beside it. Dallas arrived through a referral from Marcus, who had quietly become something between a client and an investor. A man who understood before most that Ray wasn't building a landscaping company. He was building a design philosophy, and the landscaping was just where it happened to be expressed first. The Dallas project was a mixed-use residential development that required Ray to operate at a scale that would have been unrecognizable to the man who'd stood on a Tempe curb with an eviction notice 2 years prior. He flew out on a Monday, walked the site on Tuesday, had the conceptual drawings done by Thursday, and signed the contract on Friday. He rebranded on the flight home. Caldwell Estates Landscape Design. Caleb, now operations director, had the new signage up within a week. Nashville followed Dallas. Atlanta followed Nashville. A skyline contract in Phoenix. A residential tower whose outdoor terrace and rooftop design became the subject of an architectural review that circulated through the industry like a quiet rumor, arrived in year 5 and changed the conversation about what Ray's company actually was. He was no longer the man you called for your estate grounds. He was the man you called when the project required someone who understood that land was not a backdrop but a building material. The Forbes piece ran in year 6. The headline read, "The Landscaper Who Disrupted Luxury Real Estate." The photograph showed Ray on a job site in Atlanta, sleeves rolled up, reviewing plans. He had not worn the straw hat to the shoot. It was hanging in his office by then, framed against the wall above his desk in a simple black frame, the sweat stains still visible, the brim still bent from 3 years of Phoenix sun. His assistant had suggested gently that he might want to replace it with something more appropriate to the aesthetic of the space. Ray had looked at her for a moment, and then looked at the hat and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. He was still first on site every morning, still carried the same notebook, a new one every few months, same cheap spiral kind from the drugstore, same ballpoint pen. The tools were different now, the scale was different. The truck had been replaced by a company vehicle he rarely drove himself, but the discipline was identical. The focus was identical. He had built an empire the same way he had once built a front yard in Phoenix, methodically, patiently, one deliberate thing at a time, refusing to let any version of the current success become an excuse to stop before the vision was finished. The hat on the wall was not a trophy. It was a calibration instrument, a daily reminder of exactly what this had cost, and exactly what it had been worth. The life Gary had chosen looked exactly like what she had wanted for approximately 3 years. Derek Holt was generous in the way that men who have too much money are sometimes generous. Large gestures, visible expenditure, the kind of giving that comes with an audience built in. There was a condominium in Arcadia with a kitchen that had never been used for anything more demanding than reheating delivery. There were dinners at restaurants where the menu had no prices on the copy given to guests. There were weekends in Sedona and a standing invitation to events that required the kind of dressing up Gary had always believed she was made for. She was good at the life. She moved through it with the ease of someone who had studied the room and passed the test, poised, presented, fluent in the language of wealth adjacent. Derek's colleagues' wives accepted her with the measured warmth of women who have learned to hold their assessments until more data arrives. Gary understood she was on probation. She behaved accordingly. What she did not do was ask too many questions about the business. This was partly temperament and partly instinct. Derek did not invite questions, and Gary had learned early that the architecture of their arrangement was more stable when she didn't test its load-bearing walls. He had his accounts and his attorneys and his meetings that ended when she walked into the room. She had her wardrobe and her schedule and the condo and the card that worked reliably at every register she presented it to. It worked, until it didn't. The first indication was a tone shift in the way Derek's attorney spoke to her. A call she wasn't supposed to take, a voice calibrated to the particular frequency of a man managing outcomes rather than having a conversation. She didn't understand everything she heard. She understood enough. She mentioned it to Derek that evening. He told her not to worry about things she didn't have context for, and changed the subject with such practiced ease that she almost let it go. 2 months later, the federal charges were filed, and the context arrived all at once. The asset seizure moved with a speed that felt deliberately punitive. The accounts frozen, the properties flagged, the company vehicles collected by men with clipboards who worked through the weekend without visible inconvenience. Derek's attorneys descended in force, billing in increments so small and so constant that they seemed to be charging for the air in the conference room. The press covered it with the specific enthusiasm reserved for wealthy men whose crimes are finally legible to a general audience. Gary's name appeared in 2 articles. Not as a subject. She had signed nothing, owned nothing, had no legal fingerprints on any of it, but her name was there, attached to Derek's by proximity, which in the circles she had spent 3 years cultivating was a different kind of charge with a different kind of consequence. The condo went. The card stopped working on a Thursday with no warning. She moved into a sublet in Tempe with her designer clothes and a reputation that now required explanation at every room she tried to enter. The women who had accepted her with measured warmth measured the new data and adjusted accordingly. She was at a dinner party in Scottsdale, a smaller one now, a different tier, when she heard the name. Someone across the table was talking about a rooftop development in Atlanta, something about the design philosophy being unlike anything the industry had produced in a decade. The man speaking said the name the way people say names that have achieved a certain altitude, not introducing it, just using it the way you use a reference that everyone present is expected to recognize. Ray Caldwell. She kept her expression exactly where it was, reached for her wine glass, set it back down without drinking. Later, alone in the sublet, she opened her phone and typed his name into the search bar with the careful, almost reluctant precision of someone who suspects what they're about to find and needs a moment before they find it. The results loaded instantly. Forbes, Architectural Digest, a real estate industry profile with a photograph. Ray on a job site in Atlanta, sleeves rolled, reviewing plans, the same jaw and the same build she recognized beneath the weight of 7 years and a tailored shirt. She scrolled for a long time without stopping. The man she had left holding garden shears on a flagstone path he had built with his own hands now had his name on buildings in 5 states. She set the phone face down on the mattress and looked at the ceiling of a room she was renting by the month. The upgrade she had chosen had come with a detonator she hadn't seen. The thing she had left behind had quietly become everything she thought she was walking toward. She didn't sleep much that night. The acquisition had not been personal. That was the thing Gary would never quite be able to reconcile. That the most personal moment of her adult life had arrived as a line item in someone else's portfolio strategy. The Harmon Hill Road parcel had come to Caldwell Estates through a commercial broker in Phoenix who specialized in distressed neighborhood redevelopment. The block had aged badly in the 7 years since Ray had last driven down it. 2 of the properties vacant, 1 in foreclosure, the anchor building at the corner sitting empty with a sun-faded lease sign in the window that had clearly stopped being current information some time ago. The broker flagged it as an undervalued corridor with strong repositioning potential given the surrounding neighborhood trajectory. Ray had reviewed the site assessment on a Tuesday morning in his Atlanta office, approved the preliminary acquisition on Wednesday, and moved on to the next file before lunch. He had not looked up the address to see if he recognized it. He had recognized it immediately and looked up the next file anyway. Some things don't require ceremony. Some things are just finished. He flew into Phoenix on a Thursday. The convoy, 3 matte black SUVs, the middle one carrying Ray and his project director, the others carrying the Caldwell Estates site team, came down Harmon Hill Road at 11 in the morning on a day when the October sky over Phoenix was the specific shade of blue that makes the city look like it was designed by someone who wanted to be forgiven for the summers. Ray had not told anyone to arrange it the way it looked. He had simply arrived the way he always arrived, on time, prepared, unhurried. The vehicles happened to be what they were because that was what the company used now. The suit happened to be Italian because his assistant handled his wardrobe for site visits with clients present. None of it was staged. He had stopped needing to stage things some years ago. The neighborhood noticed anyway. It always does when money arrives with that kind of quiet confidence. He saw her before he was fully out of the vehicle. She was standing near the iron gate at the edge of the old property. Not positioned there deliberately, it seemed, more like someone who had heard something and come to confirm it, and was now regretting the confirmation. The red velvet dress was composed and deliberate in the way her clothes had always been. Her posture was controlled, but her hands were still in the particular way of someone managing their stillness rather than simply inhabiting it. 7 years collapsed into a single second. Ray looked at her the way you look at a place you used to live, with recognition, with the faint residue of what it had once meant, and with the clean, uncomplicated certainty of a man who had long since built something better elsewhere. There was no anger in it. Anger requires unfinished business, and Ray had finished this business on the day he opened his notebook in Danny Reyes's garage and decided that grief was an acceptable fuel source but a catastrophic destination. He nodded once, measured, the nod of a man who wishes someone no harm and no particular good. The nod of someone who has simply moved so far past a moment that returning to it, even in anger, would require a journey he had no interest in making. Then he walked through the gate. The project director was already talking. Square footage, demo timeline, the phased redesign plan that would eventually turn this block into something that bore no resemblance to what it had been. Ray listened and responded, and moved through the space with the focused attention he brought to every site, every project, every new thing he was building. He did not look back at the gate. The flagstone path he had once laid in this yard was long gone, pulled up with the old landscaping sometime in the years between. He noted its absence the way you note any previous version of a thing, briefly, without sentiment, as information rather than loss. He would design something better here. He always did. Behind him, near the iron gate, Gary stood in the October sun and watched him disappear into the building. The man she had handed a ring back to on a landscaped path, the man she had watched from the window of a Porsche without looking back, the man whose name she had Googled in a sublet bedroom with her heart in her throat. That man owned this street now. All of it. Every vacant lot and foreclosed property and sun-faded lease sign. He had bought it the way he built everything. Patiently, methodically, without requiring her to understand it before it was done. She stayed at the gate for a long time after the site team had moved inside. There was nothing left to wait for. There had been nothing left to wait for quite some time. But sometimes a person needs to stand in the specific location where they made the defining choice of their life and let the full weight of it arrive without interruption. The October wind moved through the empty yard. Somewhere inside, Ray Caldwell was already designing what came next. He had never once stopped.